There is a lake high in the mountains that has been there longer than anyone can remember. In the daytime, when the wind moves across it, its surface breaks into 1,000 small waves. And if you look down into it then, you see only motion, only glare, only the scattered pieces of the sky. But in the hour before dawn, when the wind falls still, the lake grows perfectly smooth, and you can look all the way down through it to the stones resting on the bottom, undisturbed, exactly as they have always been. Tonight, we are going to sit beside that lake for a while, not to change anything about it, not to fix the waves or hurry the wind along, but simply to wait with it until the surface settles on its own, the way it always does, the way it always has. Before we begin, you might let your shoulders drop an inch from wherever they have been holding themselves all day. You do not need to do anything else yet, just that. There is an old teaching that says, the mind, left alone, returns to stillness, the way water does. It is not something we have to manufacture out of nothing. It is something that is always underneath, waiting for the wind to pass. Tonight, we will walk through a handful of stories and teachings drawn from the Buddhist and Zen traditions, each one turning gently around this same idea. That peace is not a far country we must travel to, but a home we have simply stopped visiting. There is nothing to memorize here, nothing to hold on to tightly. If you drift away from these words halfway through a sentence and fall asleep, that will not be a failure of the story. That will be the story working exactly as it should. Let us begin. Long ago, in a small fishing village where the tide came in twice a day and left twice a day without fail, there lived a boatman who ferried people across a wide river to the market town on the other side. He had done this work for so many years that his hands had gone hard and brown from the oars, and the villagers said of him that nothing ever seemed to trouble his face, not storms, not difficult passengers, not the long cold crossings in winter when the wind cut through every layer of cloth a person owned. One autumn morning, a merchant climbed into his boat, anxious and short of breath, clutching a satchel of goods he needed to sell before the market closed at midday. "Hurry," the merchant said, before they had even pushed off from the shore. "I cannot be late. Everything depends on this." The boatman nodded, said nothing, and began to row at his usual steady pace, no faster than any other morning. The merchant grew more agitated with every stroke. He leaned forward as if his own leaning might push the boat along faster. He watched the sun climbing the sky and multiplied the minutes in his head. "Faster," he said again. "You do not understand. If I am late, I lose everything I have worked for." The boatman only rowed on, unhurried, and said, The river moves at the river's pace, and so do I within it. I have never once made the crossing faster by rowing in fear. Fear only tires the arms. It does not move the water. The merchant did not understand this, and he spent the whole crossing gripping the sides of the boat, imagining every way the morning could go wrong, rehearsing conversations he had not yet had, growing sick with worry over a market he could not yet see. By the time they reached the far shore, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the crossing itself. He had crossed the river twice that morning, once in the boat and once entirely uselessly in his own mind. As it happened, he arrived with time to spare. His stall was still there, his goods sold well. And that evening, waiting for the boatman to ferry him home again, he sat down across from the old man and asked him plainly, "How is it that you are never troubled? I have watched you row through storms without your face changing at all." The boatman considered this for a while before answering. "I'm troubled sometimes," he said. "The river is not always calm, and neither am I. But I have learned that worry does not go ahead of me and smooth the water. It only rides in the boat, taking up a seat and adding weight I did not need to carry. So when I feel it climb in, I let it sit there if it must, but I do not let it take the oars." This is one of the oldest teachings in this tradition, offered in 100 different forms across 100 different centuries. The mind, when it is anxious, believes it is doing something useful. It believes that if it worries hard enough, turns a problem over enough times, imagines enough outcomes, it is somehow preparing itself, protecting itself, gaining some kind of ground. But worry does not row the boat. It only rides along inside it, and very often it is the heaviest passenger of all. If you notice right now some thought that has been riding along with you today, uninvited, taking up its seat and refusing to help with the oars, you do not have to throw it overboard. You do not have to argue with it or convince it to leave. You can simply notice that it is there, the way the boatman noticed the merchant's fear, calmly, without alarm, and go on rowing anyway, at your own unhurried pace, all the way to the other shore. Let us rest here a moment before we go on. There is nowhere else you need to arrive tonight. There is a story told among certain old Zen communities of a monk who lived alone at the edge of a forest, tending a small garden that fed him through every season. He was known in the nearby village for a peculiar habit. Whenever misfortune struck him, whenever the villagers came running with news of some new disaster in his little life, he would only nod slowly and say, "Maybe so, maybe not." One year, his only horse ran off into the forest and did not return. The villagers came to console him, "What terrible luck," they said. "Now you have no horse to help with the planting." "Maybe so, maybe not," said the monk, and went back to his tea. A week later, the horse returned from the forest, and with it came 3 wild horses that had followed it home. "Now look," the villagers said, "what wonderful luck! You have gained 3 horses for the price of losing one." "Maybe so, maybe not," said the monk. His only son, delighted by the new horses, tried to break one of them and was thrown from its back, breaking his leg badly in the fall. The villagers came again, shaking their heads. "What terrible luck," they said. "Your only son, lamed right before the harvest, when you need him most." "Maybe so, maybe not," said the monk, and set his son's leg with the same steady hands he used for everything else. Not long after, soldiers came through the village, conscripting every able-bodied young man for a war being fought in a distant province from which few conscripts ever returned. Because of his broken leg, the monk's son was passed over and left at home. "What wonderful luck," the villagers said, breathless now, that the boy broke his leg exactly when he did. "Maybe so, maybe not," said the monk, watching his son limp across the garden, alive. The villagers, of course, wanted the story to end there, with the monk proven wise, his patience rewarded, the pattern completed. But the old teachers who tell this story usually let it run further, because life does too. The son's leg healed crooked, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. And there were mornings the monk watched him struggle across uneven ground and felt something ache in his own chest that no amount of maybe so, maybe not could entirely soften. And there were other days, years later, when that very limp kept the son from a dangerous logging job that claimed 2 of his friends, and the monk said nothing at all, only rested his hand for a moment on his son's shoulder as they passed the fell trees on the road. What the monk understood, and what took him a whole lifetime of these small reversals to understand, was not that good and bad cancel each other out neatly, like figures on a ledger. It was something quieter than that. It was that the mind rushes to name a thing the instant it happens, calls it fortune or calls it ruin, and then builds a whole story on top of that first quick judgment. A story about what it means and what will happen next and who is to blame, when the truth is that the moment has barely finished happening and none of us can see nearly as far down the road as we believe we can in that instant of naming. This does not mean we stop caring what happens to us. The monk cared. He cared about his son's leg, and he cared about the war, and he cared, in his quiet way, about the horses too. But he had learned not to build the whole weight of his peace on top of a judgment made in the first 5 seconds after something occurred, because he had watched again and again across a long life how often that first judgment turned out to be only half the story, or a tenth of it, or the wrong story altogether, revealed later to have been something else entirely, wearing a disguise. If something happened to you today that you have already decided is a disaster, or something else happened that you have already decided is a triumph, you do not have to unmake either judgment tonight. You only have to hold it a little more loosely than you have been holding it, the way the monk held his, with room left over for the story to keep telling itself long after tonight is over. Let us pause again here for a moment. Feel the weight of your body sinking a little further into wherever you are resting. There is nothing that needs deciding right now. There is a teaching the Buddha is said to have given using the image of a lute, an old stringed instrument played by plucking. A musician came to him once, troubled, and asked how a person ought to practice the mind, whether it should be forced into stillness through great effort or left entirely alone to wander wherever it liked. The Buddha asked the musician a question in return. When you tune your lute, he said, and the strings are pulled too tight, what happens when you play them? They snap, said the musician, or they sound harsh and thin, nothing like music at all. And when the strings are left too loose, the Buddha asked, what then? Then there is no sound worth hearing, said the musician. The notes fall flat and dead, and nothing rings true. So where does the music live? The Buddha asked. In the string that is too tight, or the string that is too loose? Neither, said the musician. It lives somewhere between the two, in a tension that is neither slack nor strained. Just so, said the Buddha, with the mind. This teaching has been carried forward across centuries because it resists a very common mistake people make when they first go looking for peace, which is to assume that peace means slackness, that a calm mind is a mind that has simply stopped trying, stopped caring, gone loose and flat, like a string with no tension left in it at all. But a mind gone entirely slack does not produce ease. It produces a kind of fog, a dullness that people sometimes mistake for calm because it is at least quiet, but which has none of the aliveness that true peace carries within it. And the opposite mistake is just as common, perhaps more so in a world that prizes effort and achievement above almost everything else. We tighten the string past its proper pitch, believing that if a little discipline is good, more discipline must be better. That if we only push harder against our anxious thoughts, control our days more completely, plan further ahead, grip more firmly, we will eventually force our way into some fortress of calm. But a string pulled too tight does not make finer music. It only waits to snap, and when it does, the sound it makes on the way is nothing anyone wanted to hear. There was once a weaver in a river town who made the finest cloth anyone in the region had ever seen. Cloth so fine that merchants traveled many days just to buy a single bolt of it. Her secret, she told her apprentices, though most of them never quite believed her, was not skill with her hands, though her hands were certainly skilled. Her secret was that she never wove a thread pulled too tight, nor left slack. Too tight, she said, and the cloth puckers and tears the first time it is washed. Too loose, and it sags and loses its shape within a season. The whole art is listening to the thread as you draw it through, feeling for that place, always slightly different depending on the day, the weather, the wool itself, where the tension is just enough and no more. One of her apprentices, a serious young woman who wanted very much to become a master weaver as quickly as possible, took this lesson and applied it only to her loom, and for years produced cloth that was competent but never extraordinary. It was only much later, after she had left her teacher's workshop and made a difficult marriage and lost a child and rebuilt her life more than once, that she understood the old weaver had never really been talking only about thread. She had been talking about how tightly to hold a plan before life changed it, how tightly to hold a grief before it changed shape on its own, how tightly to hold an ambition, a fear, a hope for someone she loved. The whole art, and it was the whole art of nearly everything, was listening for that place, always slightly different depending on the day, where the holding was just enough and no more. If you have been pulling something too tight lately, whether it is a plan, a worry, a hope for how tomorrow ought to go, you might imagine, just for tonight, loosening that string by the smallest amount, not letting go of it entirely, only easing the pitch down until it stops straining against itself, until something in it can finally ring true instead of thin. Let us rest here together for a little while. There is no string that needs tuning right this moment. Only the slow rise and fall of your own breath, which has never once needed your instruction to know how to continue. There is a story from the old collections about a potter's apprentice, though this one is not about pottery at all in the end, but about attention, and about the strange way that watching something too closely can sometimes be its own kind of interference. The apprentice had been given the task of watching over a kiln through a long firing, one of the most delicate stages in the whole craft, when the temperature inside must rise slowly and evenly, or the pieces within will crack from the shock of uneven heat. He was young and eager to prove himself, and so he stationed himself directly beside the kiln door and did not move from it for hours, peering through the small viewing hole again and again, adjusting the fire at the slightest change he thought he noticed, opening the door briefly more than once just to be certain everything inside was progressing as it should. By morning, when the master potter came to check on the firing, nearly every piece inside the kiln had cracked. The apprentice was devastated and could not understand it. "I watched it every moment," he said. "I never once looked away. I checked it constantly to be sure nothing was going wrong." "That," said the master gently, "was exactly the trouble. Every time you opened that door to look closer, you let the cold air in and shocked the very pieces you were trying to protect. Every time you adjusted the fire at some small flicker you thought you saw, you disturbed a process that needed only to be left steady and undisturbed to do its own slow work. You did not fail this firing because you failed to pay attention. You failed it because you paid the wrong kind of attention, the anxious kind, the kind that cannot trust a process to unfold without constant interference." The master had the apprentice try again with the next firing, but this time gave him a different instruction. "Build the fire well at the start," she said. "Check it only a few times through the night at long, unhurried intervals, and otherwise sit some distance away and let it be. Trust the kiln to do what a well-built kiln does." The apprentice found this almost unbearably difficult at first. The urge to hover, to check, to make some small correcting gesture every few minutes was so strong that he had to physically sit on his hands more than once through that long night. But by morning, when the master came again, nearly every piece had survived, whole and true. There is a kind of watching we do over our own lives that works very much like that first anxious night at the kiln. We check and recheck a worry, opening the door to look at it again and again, believing that this vigilance is what keeps disaster at bay, when very often it is the checking itself that lets the cold air in, that disturbs the slow and steady process that only needed to be left alone to finish its own quiet work. A difficult conversation we are dreading does not go better because we have rehearsed it 40 times before it happens. A decision we are uncertain about does not clarify itself because we turn it over for the 100th time at 2 in the morning. Some things, like the pieces inside that kiln, need heat and time, and to be left steady, undisturbed by our constant well-meaning interference. This is not a teaching about carelessness. The master built the fire well before she ever sat back and trusted it. Preparation still matters. Attention still matters. But there is a kind of attention that steadies a thing and a kind that only shakes it. And the difference between them is very often nothing more than knowing when to stop opening the door. If there is something in your life tonight that you have been checking on too often, worrying over with that same anxious hovering, you might, just for these next few minutes, imagine setting it a little distance away from you, the way the apprentice learned to sit back from the kiln, trusting that whatever fire you have already built beneath it is doing exactly what a well-built fire does, quietly, steadily, without needing you to watch every second of it happen. Let us be still together for a while. Nothing needs checking right now. Only this breath and the one after it, arriving on their own. There is an old story about a bell maker who lived in the mountains, whose bells were said to carry further and ring truer than any others in the province, so that temples from distant towns sent messengers asking him to cast bells for their halls, offering him more gold than most craftsmen saw in a lifetime. A young man traveled a great distance to study under him, hoping to learn the secret of the bell maker's famous sound. Certain there must be some rare metal, some hidden formula, some technique passed down in secrecy that produced that particular clear and lasting tone. What he found when he arrived surprised him. The bell maker used ordinary bronze, the same alloy any competent caster in the region could obtain. His workshop held no secret tools. His methods, as far as the young man could see, watching him work day after day, were unremarkable in every visible way. Frustrated after many weeks of watching and learning nothing that explained the mystery, the young man finally asked outright, "Everyone says your bells ring truer than any others. I have watched everything you do, and I see nothing different from any other bell maker's methods. What is your secret?" The old man set down his tools and considered the question for a long while before answering. "When I pour the bronze," he said, "I'm only pouring bronze. When I shape the mold, I'm only shaping the mold. When I strike the bell to test it, I'm only listening." Most casters, even skilled ones, are somewhere else while they work. They are thinking of the gold this bell will bring them, or worrying whether the last one they made was good enough, or already planning the next commission before this one is even finished. Their hands are here, but they themselves are scattered across a dozen other moments that have not happened yet, or have already passed. A bell cast by scattered hands carries something of that scattering in its sound, even if no one listening could say exactly what is wrong with it. It simply does not ring as true. My only secret is that when I am here, I am entirely here, and nowhere else at all. The young man did not believe this could be the whole answer, and he stayed on for several more years, trying to catch some other secret the old man was surely hiding. But slowly, almost without noticing it happening, he found that his own bells, cast with exactly the same ordinary bronze, using exactly the same visible methods, began to ring truer than they once had. And when he examined honestly what had actually changed in him over those years, he found it was not his technique. It was that he had slowly stopped being somewhere else while his hands were working. He had stopped pouring the bronze while his mind was busy poring over some worry about the harvest, or some old argument with his brother, or some fear about whether he would ever be as good as his teacher. He had simply learned the long, slow way, the only way this particular thing can be learned, to be where his hands already were. Most of what wears us down in an ordinary day is not the day itself, but the way we are rarely fully inside it. We eat a meal while planning tomorrow's difficult conversation and taste almost none of it. We sit with someone we love while replaying something unkind a colleague said hours earlier and are not really sitting with them at all. We lie down to rest and find that rest will not come, because though the body has stopped moving, the mind is still out pouring bronze for a bell it has not even begun to build yet. Some imagined future difficulty that has not arrived, and perhaps never will. There is nothing dramatic required to close this gap. The bell maker did not describe some elaborate practice. He only said that when he poured the bronze, he was only pouring the bronze. Tonight, there is very little required of you except to lie where you are lying and breathe the breath you are already breathing. And let that be enough, the whole of it. Nothing borrowed from tomorrow and nothing owed to yesterday. Let us rest in that for a moment. Wherever you are right now is the only place you need to be. There is a teaching, old and simply put, that compares the untrained mind to a house with 5 doors and 5 windows, all standing open at once, so that wind rushes in from every direction, and nothing inside the house can ever come to rest. A monkey inside such a house, the old teachers said, would leap from door to window to door, chasing every draught, never once settling, because there is always another opening, pulling its attention toward it. This is such an old comparison, the restless mind and the leaping monkey, that it has almost become too familiar to really land anymore. The way any true thing repeated too often can start to slide past us unheard. So let me tell it differently, the way it was once told to me, through a story about an actual house rather than a metaphorical one. There was a large old house at the edge of a village, inherited by a woman from her grandmother, full of doors that no longer closed properly and windows that rattled loose in their frames whenever the wind picked up. She loved the house and could not bear to leave it. But she could not sleep in it either, not truly, because every night the wind found some new gap to whistle through, some new door to rattle, and she would startle awake again and again, convinced each time that something was wrong, going from room to room, checking latches that never quite held. A carpenter came through the village one autumn, and she asked him to look at the house. He walked through every room slowly, running his hands along the frames, testing each door, and at the end, He told her something she had not expected. "You do not have a house with too much wind getting in," he said. "You have a house with too many places letting it in. The wind outside has not changed. It is the same wind that blows every autumn. What has changed is that these doors have warped over the years, and these windows have loosened, so that a wind which used to pass by the house now finds a dozen ways inside it." He spent the following weeks repairing each door so it closed fully, refitting each window so it sat snugly in its frame, not sealing the house shut entirely. She still wanted to hear the world outside, still wanted a little air moving through on a warm night, but making it so that the wind entered only where she chose to let it. Through the one window she left cracked open by her own bed, rather than through every loose seam in the whole structure at once. That first night after his work was finished, she slept through until morning for the first time in longer than she could remember. The wind had not stopped. It blew just as hard as it always had. But it no longer found a dozen unintended ways into the rooms where she was trying to rest. And so it passed by outside instead, doing what wind does, without keeping her startled awake to chase it from room to room. Our minds are very much like that old house, worn open in a dozen small places by years of habit, so that ordinary winds, an unanswered message, an unfinished task, a comment someone made in passing, find their way in through every loose seam and keep us leaping from room to room long after the useful thinking about them is finished. The work of settling a mind is not usually about stopping the wind, which we cannot do and were never meant to do. It is closer to the carpenter's work, tending the loose places one at a time, so that the wind that reaches us through a door we have actually chosen, rather than through every crack that years of habit have left open. You do not have to repair every loose window in yourself tonight. The carpenter did not fix the whole house in one evening either. It took him weeks, one frame at a time. But you might notice, just for tonight, which door the wind is coming through right now. Which one worry, thought, keeps rattling its frame. And you might, gently, without any struggle, simply let that one door swing shut for the night, knowing it will still be there to tend to tomorrow if it needs tending at all. Let us be quiet together for a while now. Whatever has been rattling can rest until morning. There is a story told about a young man who left his village to study meditation with a teacher who lived far up a mountain, in a hermitage so remote that the walk there took the better part of 3 days. He arrived exhausted, expecting to be taught some elaborate method the moment he sat down, some sequence of breaths or postures or sacred words that would unlock the peace he had traveled so far to find. Instead, the old teacher simply pointed to a spot on the floor and told him to sit. The young man sat, Nothing else happened. No instruction came. He waited, increasingly puzzled, and finally asked, "When will you teach me how to still my mind?" The teacher looked at him with something like amusement. "Who told you your mind needed to be stilled by force?" he asked. "I assumed," said the young man, "that this was the whole purpose of practice, to make the mind quiet." The teacher shook his head slowly. "You cannot make a muddy pond clear by stirring it harder," he said. "You can only stop stirring it and wait." The young man did not fully understand this and spent his first weeks at the hermitage trying very hard to stop thinking, which of course only produced more thinking, an increasingly frantic effort to not think that was itself an enormous amount of thinking. Layered on top of thinking about how badly the not thinking was going. He grew frustrated, certain he was failing at something the teacher had made sound simple. One afternoon, exhausted from the effort of trying so hard to empty his mind, he gave up entirely, at least for that one sitting, and simply let himself think whatever he was going to think, without fighting it, without judging it, without trying to fix or stop or redirect any of it. And in the strange way that these things sometimes work, it was in that very moment of giving up the fight that something in him actually began to settle. Not because he had finally succeeded at stilling his mind through greater effort, but because he had finally stopped stirring it through the effort itself. He went to the teacher afterward, unsure whether to be pleased or confused. "I stopped trying so hard," he said, "and something got quieter." Was that the method all along? The teacher smiled. The method, he said, was never about adding effort. It was about noticing how much unnecessary effort you were already making, and slowly, patiently, setting pieces of it down. The pond does not need you to still it. It only needs you to stop being the one stirring it. This distinction matters more than it might seem to at first, because so much of what we call trying to relax is, if we are honest about it, actually a great deal of effort aimed at achieving a state that by its very nature cannot be achieved through effort. We lie down at night and instruct ourselves sternly to relax, to stop thinking, to fall asleep already. And this instruction, however well meant, is itself a kind of stirring, one more hand reaching into the pond, one more small wave added to a surface that only wanted to be left alone. Tonight, there is nothing you need to force still. If thoughts are moving through your mind right now, small ripples from the day, unfinished conversations, tomorrow's list, you do not need to fight them or empty them out. You can let them move exactly as they are moving, without adding your own effort into the mix. And trust the way that old teacher trusted, that a pond left alone settles on its own, in its own time, without ever once needing to be told how. Let us rest here for a little while without reaching for anything at all. There is a Zen story, very short, very old, about a student who came to his teacher deeply frustrated after months of practice that seemed to be producing nothing. "I sit every day," he said, "and still my mind wanders constantly. I have made no progress at all." The teacher asked him a simple question. "When you were a small child, first learning to walk, did you fall down?" "Of course," said the student, "many times." "And did you consider this failure?" the teacher asked. "Or did you understand it was simply what learning to walk looked like?" The student had no answer for this at first. "Your wandering mind is not evidence that your practice has failed," the teacher finally said. "It is what practice looks like. Every single time, for every single person who has ever attempted it. The wandering is not the obstacle to the path. Noticing the wandering and returning, gently, without punishment, again and again, that is the entire path itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because so many of us carry a quiet, almost unspoken belief that peace, once achieved, becomes a permanent condition, a finish line crossed after which the mind simply stays settled from then on. And when it does not, when the old worries return, when some new difficulty arrives and knocks us off balance again, after we had believed ourselves finally past all that, we tend to read this not as the ordinary and expected shape of a whole human life, but as some private failure, evidence that we did the work wrong, or were never really cut out for peace in the first place. But no teacher in this whole long tradition, none of the old masters whose stories have survived across so many centuries, ever claimed to have crossed some final line after which nothing could disturb them again. What they claimed, when they claimed anything at all, was something much humbler and much more useful, that they had gotten a little quicker at noticing when they had wandered, that they had grown a little gentler with themselves in the return, that the falling still happened, the way it happens to every person who has ever tried to walk, but that the falling bothered them a little less than it once had, and the getting back up came a little more easily each time. If today has been a day where your own mind wandered constantly, where the peace you were hoping to feel simply did not arrive, no matter how much you wanted it to, this is not a sign that something has gone wrong in you. It is only the ordinary texture of a mind doing what minds do. And the whole of the practice, tonight and every night, is only this: noticing where you have wandered to, and gently, without any scolding at all, turning back toward the breath that has been waiting for you this entire time, patient as it always is, right here, asking nothing of you but your return. Let us return together now, for just a while, to nothing more complicated than this breath, arriving and leaving on its own. There is one more story I want to leave with you tonight, and it is one of the oldest in this whole tradition, though it is often told in different clothes depending on who is telling it. A traveler walking a long road between two distant towns grew thirsty in the heat of the afternoon and stopped at a well beside the road to drink. As he lowered the bucket, he noticed an old woman sitting nearby, weaving a basket from reeds she had gathered at the water's edge. And he asked her, out of simple politeness, how far it was to the next town and what kind of people lived there. The old woman set down her weaving and asked him a question in return before answering his. What were the people like? She asked. In the town you have just come from? The traveler's face darkened. Terrible, he said. Suspicious, cold, unwilling to help a stranger. I could not wait to leave that place. The old woman nodded slowly. I am sorry to tell you, she said, that you will find the very same people in the next town. Some while later, another traveler stopped at the same well and asked the same question. And the old woman asked him the same thing in return. What were the people like in the town you have just come from? This traveler smiled at the memory. Wonderful, he said, warm, generous, quick to welcome a tired stranger with a meal and a place to rest. I was almost sad to leave. The old woman smiled back at him. You will find the very same people in the next town, she said. A boy who had been listening from a little distance, the well-keeper's grandson, could not understand this and ran to ask her about it once both travelers had gone on their way. How can that be true? He asked. That the same town holds terrible people for one traveler and wonderful people for another? Surely it cannot be both. The old woman went back to her weaving, working the reeds carefully into shape as she answered him. It is not the town that changes from traveler to traveler, she said. It is what each of them is carrying with them on the road. The man who found only coldness in his last town carried his own guarded heart into every doorway he approached. And people, sensing it, however faintly, however unconsciously, met him with the very same guardedness he brought. The man who found warmth carried an open hand into every doorway instead. And the town, sensing that too, opened itself back to him in turn. The next town will not be kind or unkind on its own. It will very largely become, for each of them, whatever they carry into it. This story has outlived so many centuries because it points at something true and slightly uncomfortable, which is that a great deal of what we experience as the world's harshness or the world's warmth is not entirely separate from what we ourselves are bringing into every room we enter. This is not the whole truth, of course. Real cruelty exists in the world, entirely independent of what anyone carries toward it. And no old story about a well should ever be used to suggest that a person harmed by genuine unkindness somehow brought that unkindness upon themselves. That was never the old woman's meaning, and it is not this one either. But there is still something worth carrying from it, gently into an ordinary day, which is that the guardedness we sometimes bring into a room, born of some earlier hurt that had nothing to do with the people currently standing in front of us, has a way of calling forth the very coldness we were afraid of finding, while an open and unguarded heart, offered even when it is difficult to offer, has a way of finding more warmth waiting for it than we expected. There is nothing you need to decide about this tonight. You do not need to resolve, right now, half asleep, to walk differently into tomorrow than you walked into today. It is enough simply to have heard the story, to let it sit somewhere quiet in you, ready to surface on its own, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps some other day, entirely. The next time you find yourself standing in a doorway deciding without quite realizing you are deciding anything at all, what you are about to carry through it. Let us rest here for a while longer, carrying nothing at all, needing to decide nothing at all. There is a story about a stonemason who spent the better part of his life building a single bridge across a wide and difficult river. A project so large that it passed from his hands to his son's hands before it was finished, and very nearly to his son's son as well. In the early years, when he was young and the work was new, he used to stand at the edge of the riverbank every evening and calculate how much further there was to go, how many more stones, how many more seasons, how many more years before the bridge would finally join one bank to the other. These calculations left him exhausted and more than once close to despair. The river was very wide, and he was only one man, and the arithmetic of it, laid out plainly in his mind each evening, felt like a weight almost too heavy to carry back to his small house at the end of each day. One evening, an old traveling monk stopped near the bridge to rest and watched the mason standing at the water's edge with that same familiar look of quiet despair on his face. "What troubles you?" the monk asked, "at the end of a day that has clearly gone well? I can see the new stones you have set today." "Nothing troubles today," the mason admitted. "Today went exactly as a good day should. It is tomorrow that troubles me, and the years of tomorrows after that, because I have just finished counting how many stones remain. And the number is larger than I can bear to think about." The monk sat down on a half-finished section of the wall and considered this for a while. "Tell me," he said finally, "what did you actually do today with your own two hands?" "I quarried 3 stones," the mason said, "and set 2 of them into the north pier and mixed enough mortar to finish the joint before the light went." "That is a full day's work," said the monk. "Yes," the mason agreed, "but it is such a small piece of the whole." The monk nodded. And tomorrow? He asked. What will you do tomorrow? I will quarry more stones, said the mason, and set them, and mix more mortar. Then you already know exactly what tomorrow requires of you, said the monk, and it sounds very much like what today required of you. No more and no less. Where in that does the whole unfinished bridge come into it? The mason did not have a ready answer. The monk went on. You are the only stonemason I have ever met who has managed to make himself weary in the evening, not from the stones he actually carried, but from a bridge he has not built yet, and, if I understand rightly, will very likely not finish within his own lifetime at all. That whole vast, unfinished bridge, stretching out across the water in your mind every evening, is not a real weight. It is an imagined one, borrowed from a future that has not arrived, and may look nothing at all like what you are currently picturing. The real weight, the only real weight there has ever been on any single day of this project, was 3 stones. You have already carried that today. It is finished. Put it down. The mason turned this over for a long time after the monk continued on his way. In the years that followed, he tried, not perfectly, not every single evening, but more often than not, to let his accounting stop at the edge of each actual day. 3 stones quarried, 2 set, a joint finished before the light failed. He still thought sometimes, in weaker moments, of the whole wide river and how far there was left to go. And on those evenings, the old despair still crept back in exactly as it always had. But more and more, as the years passed, he found he could set down the imagined bridge and pick up only the real one. The one made of the particular stones his hands had actually touched that day. And this smaller and truer accounting he found he could carry without difficulty. Evening after evening, for the rest of his working life. He did not live to see the bridge completed. It was his son, and later his son's son, who set the final stones, decades after the old mason had died. But those who knew him in his later years said that something in him had changed after that evening by the river, that he had grown into a man who worked with a kind of settled ease that seemed strange for someone attempting something so enormous. And when they asked him about it, he would only say that he had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to count only the stones in front of him and to leave the whole unfinished river for tomorrow, which would arrive carrying its own 3 stones and no more, exactly as today always had. Almost everyone carries some version of that unfinished bridge in their mind at the end of a long day. Some enormous, unresolved thing stretching out ahead of them across the water. And it is worth asking gently before sleep whether what is actually keeping you awake tonight is the real weight of today, or the imagined weight of a whole river you were never asked to cross in a single evening. Today, whatever it held is already finished. It does not need carrying any further than this moment. Tomorrow will bring its own 3 stones, and no more than that. And there will be time enough to quarry them when tomorrow actually arrives. Let us rest in that for a while. There is no river to cross tonight, only the stones already set, and the quiet after a day's work is done. There is a very old story, older than most of the others we have shared tonight, about a woman who kept a small tea house at a crossroads where several trade routes met, so that travelers of every kind passed through her door. Merchants and monks, soldiers and farmers, the fortunate and the ruined, all resting for an hour or an evening, before continuing on toward wherever their own lives were taking them. Over many years of pouring tea for so many different kinds of people, she noticed something she found strange at first, and then, the longer she watched it, found simply true. It was never the travelers who had the least who complained the most about their lot, nor the ones who had the most who seemed the most at ease. It seemed to bear almost no relationship to what a person was actually carrying, and everything to do with something else entirely, something harder to name. One evening, 2 travelers arrived within an hour of each other, both merchants, both roughly the same age, both, as it happened, having lost a very similar sum of money that same week through very similar circumstances. An unfavorable trade gone wrong in a distant town. The first merchant sat at her counter and could speak of nothing else. He described the loss in exhaustive detail, returned to it again and again through the evening, grew angrier each time he retold it, and left the next morning still turning it over, clearly carrying it with him down the road, exactly as heavily as when he had arrived. The second merchant, when she asked him gently how his travels were going, mentioned the loss only briefly, almost in passing, said it had been a hard week, finished his tea, asked her a few warm questions about her own life and the town around them, and left the next morning speaking cheerfully of the towns still ahead of him on his route. She could not stop thinking about the 2 of them for years afterward, and eventually, much later in her life, she had the chance to ask a wandering teacher who stopped at her tea house what he made of it. 2 men, nearly identical losses, such entirely different ways of carrying them. He thought about it for a long while before answering. There is a teaching, he said, about 2 arrows. The first arrow is whatever actually happens to us. The money lost, the illness that comes, the person who leaves. That arrow strikes everyone alike, and there is no way to live a whole life and avoid it. But there is a second arrow, and this one we fire into ourselves again and again, every time we retell the story of the first one. Every time we add the question of why this had to happen to us specifically. Every time we let it become not simply an event that occurred, but a verdict on our whole life, and our whole luck, and our whole worth. Your first merchant was struck once by the actual loss, and then struck himself with that second arrow perhaps 100 times more over the course of one evening, simply in the retelling. Your second merchant felt the first arrow just as sharply, I'm certain of that. A hard week is a hard week for anyone, but he set down the bow before firing a second one into the same wound. The teacher went on. This is not a matter of one man caring more than the other, or one being stronger than the other. Often, it is simply a matter of a habit, worn into a person over years, of picking the bow back up without even noticing they have done it. And it is a habit that can be unlearned, the same slow way any habit is unlearned, by noticing again and again the moment just after the first arrow lands, when the hand reaches automatically for the second one, and by choosing as many times as it takes to set the bow back down instead. The woman thought about this story for the rest of her own long life, and she said, in her later years, that it had changed the way she poured tea for every traveler who came through her door after that. Because she began to notice in her own small daily losses, the spilled cup, the argument with a neighbor, the ache of a particular memory that visited her some evenings uninvited. Exactly that same moment. The first arrow landing. And then, close behind it, her own hand reaching for the bow. She did not always manage to set it back down, but she managed it far more often than she once had, simply from having learned to notice the reaching in the first place. Whatever struck you today, if anything struck you today, has already landed. That much cannot be undone now, and does not need to be undone, only felt honestly, for whatever it actually was. But if you notice, lying here now, some part of you still reaching for a second arrow, still retelling the story, still adding one more question of why, or one more account of how unfair it was, you do not have to fire it. You can simply notice the reach, the way that old teacher taught, and let the bow rest quietly where it is, at least for tonight, at least until sleep comes and carries the whole matter, first arrow and all, gently out of your hands entirely. Let us be still together for a little while now. Nothing more needs to land tonight. There is a final story I want to share before we let the evening close around us. And it concerns a gardener who tended the grounds of a large estate for so many decades that no one in the household could remember a time before him. He was known among the family who employed him and the other workers on the grounds for an unusual patience with the plants under his care, a patience that sometimes frustrated the household's younger members, who wanted flowers to bloom on their own impatient schedule, in time for a particular celebration or a particular guest's arrival, and could not understand why the old gardener would not simply hurry things along. One spring, the family's youngest daughter, eager to have a particular rare flowering vine cover the garden wall in time for her wedding, which was still several months away. Begged the gardener to do something, anything, to speed its growth. He explained patiently that the vine would grow at the pace it grew, that forcing it with too much water or too much feeding would only weaken it, that some things simply required the time they required, and no clever trick could shorten that time without damaging the very thing being grown. She did not want to hear this, and in her impatience she took to watering the vine herself, secretly, far more than the gardener recommended, certain that more must be better, that she could improve on his slow methods through her own eager effort. Within weeks, the vine's leaves had yellowed and begun to drop. Its new growth had gone soft and pale, and by the time her wedding arrived, the wall stood barer than it had been in years, the plant having spent all its strength trying to process far more water than its roots could ever properly use, weakened rather than hastened by all that extra care. The old gardener, called in too late to save the season's growth, only shook his head gently and told her something she remembered for the rest of her life. Every living thing, he said, has its own season written into it before it is ever planted, and no amount of wanting, however sincere, however loving, can rewrite that season from outside. The vine did not fail you. It was simply asked to become, in a few weeks, what it needed a full year to become on its own. And when a thing is asked to hurry past its own nature, it does not skip ahead. It only weakens. She asked him, chastened, whether there was truly nothing to be done, whether patience was simply another word for helplessness, for standing by while something you cared about did not go the way you needed it to go. The gardener considered this carefully before answering, because he could see she was not only asking about the vine. There is a great deal to be done, he said. You can prepare good soil. You can offer steady light and steady water, given at the proper measure and not a drop more out of impatience. You can clear away whatever might choke or crowd the growing thing. All of that is real work, and none of it is helplessness. But there is a difference between tending something's growth and trying to manufacture that growth on your own schedule through sheer force of wanting. And the difference is exactly the difference between a vine that grows strong in its own season and one that withers early from being asked to hurry past what it actually was. The daughter's wedding went ahead with a bare wall behind her, and by all accounts it was a lovely day regardless, and the vine, left alone through the following year without any of her secret extra watering, grew back fuller and stronger than it had ever been, covering the wall completely just in time for a different celebration, a year later that no one had been rushing it toward at all. There is very often something in each of our own lives playing the part of that vine, something we love, some hope, some relationship, some piece of work we are trying to bring along, that we have been secretly overwatering out of impatience, certain that more effort, more worry, more forcing must surely bring it along faster, when what it actually needs, the only thing it has whatever actually needed is steady and patient tending, offered at the proper measure, and then enough trust to let it grow at the pace written into its own nature, which was never going to match our own impatient calendar, no matter how sincerely we wished it would. Whatever you have been trying to hurry along in your own life, you do not have to solve that tonight. And you certainly do not need to solve it by lying here working out some new plan to force it faster. You can simply let it rest, ungripped for these last few minutes, trusting that whatever good and steady tending you have already given it is enough for tonight, and that its own proper season, whatever that turns out to be, is still quietly unfolding with or without your watchfulness, standing guard over every hour of it. Let us rest in that trust for a while now, together in the quiet. There is a story about a candle maker who lived in a cold northern town, where the winters were long and the nights stretched on for many more hours than the days did. She had spent her whole working life perfecting a particular kind of candle, one that burned longer and steadier than any other in the region. And travelers sometimes went out of their way to pass through her town, simply to buy a few of them before continuing on into the dark. A young apprentice came to learn the trade from her, eager and impatient in the way young people often are, wanting to master the craft as quickly as possible. He noticed something strange in his first weeks in her workshop. Whenever a candle came out slightly imperfect, a little bent, or burning a touch unevenly, the old woman did not throw it away as waste, the way he expected. She set it aside in a particular basket by the door and used those candles herself in her own home rather than selling them. "Why do you keep the flawed ones for yourself?" he asked her one evening, "when surely the finest candles are the ones that deserve to light your own table." She smiled at this and set down her tools. "When I was younger than you are now," she said, "I threw away every candle that was not perfect, and I judged myself just as harshly as I judged the candles, certain that any flaw in the wax meant I had failed at something important. I worked myself half to exhaustion trying to make every single one flawless. And even then, some small percentage always came out imperfect, no matter how carefully I worked, because wax is wax, and wicks are wicks, and neither of them behaves with perfect obedience, no matter how much skill goes into the making. One winter," she went on, "a terrible storm kept me housebound for nearly 2 weeks, and I had used up all my good candles selling them and had nothing left in my own house but the flawed ones from that basket, the bent ones, the ones that guttered a little unevenly. I lit them anyway, because I had no other choice. And I discovered something I had never noticed before in all my years of setting them aside as failures. They still gave light. Every single one of them, bent or straight, even or uneven, still did the one thing a candle is actually for. They still pushed back the dark for just as many hours, with just as much warmth as any of the ones I considered perfect enough to sell. The apprentice asked her what she had done with that discovery. I stopped believing that a small flaw meant a failure, she said. I still work carefully, and I still aim for the finest candle I know how to make, because that care is part of what makes the work worth doing. But I no longer waste half my strength punishing myself over the bent ones, because I learned in that long cold storm that even a slightly imperfect light still lights a room exactly as fully as a perfect one does. The flaw only mattered to me. It never mattered to the darkness, which does not care in the slightest whether the candle pushing it back is perfectly straight. This is worth remembering on any evening when the day behind you did not go as smoothly as you had hoped it would, when some part of it came out a little bent, a little uneven, not quite what you had been aiming for when the morning began. The darkness outside your window tonight does not care in the least whether today was a perfect day or a flawed one. It only asks whether some light was offered against it, however that light happened to be shaped. And by that measure, almost every ordinary day, however imperfect, has already done exactly what it needed to do. Let us rest in that thought for a little while. Whatever shape today took, it was enough. It gave what it needed to give. There is one more story, an old one, about a shepherd who tended a large flock on a stretch of hillside far from any village, spending most of every year alone with his sheep and very little else for company. He had a habit that puzzled the few travelers who occasionally passed his way and stopped to share a meal with him. Each evening, as the light failed and he brought his flock back toward the fold, he would count them slowly, out loud, touching each animal lightly on the head as it passed through the gate. Though everyone who watched him do this could see plainly that he already knew, without any need to count at all, whether every sheep had returned. He knew each one by sight, by the particular pattern of its coat, by the small ways it moved differently from its neighbors. He did not need the count to know they were all there. And yet, every single evening, without exception, he counted anyway. A young traveler who stayed with him for several nights finally asked him about it. "You clearly know your flock well enough not to need the counting," he said. "Why do it every single evening when you could see at a glance whether any were missing?" The shepherd considered the question for a while before answering, resting his hand on the gate as the last of the sheep settled into the fold for the night. "I do not count them because I doubt myself," he said. "I count them because the counting itself is what lets me stop thinking about them once it is finished. If I did not count, some part of my mind would keep circling back through the day all evening, wondering, had I truly seen everyone? Was there perhaps one I had missed without noticing? Some doubt that would follow me right into sleep and keep me from resting properly. But once I have counted, once I have touched each head and said each number out loud and closed the gate behind the last one, that part of my mind can finally close as well. The counting is not really about the sheep. It is about giving myself permission to stop worrying about the sheep. The traveler asked him whether he ever miscounted, whether the ritual ever failed him. Of course, said the shepherd. Some evenings I lose track and have to begin again from the start. Some evenings a lamb wanders back late after I have already finished, and I have to go out again into the dark to bring it in and count once more before I can finally rest. The counting is not a magic that guarantees nothing will ever go wrong. It is only a way of marking clearly and definitely the end of the day's watching, so that the watching does not simply bleed on formlessly into the night with no clear edge to it at all. This is, in its own quiet way, very close to what all of us are doing whenever we manage, at the end of a long day, to actually set the day down and rest. We are not pretending that everything went perfectly or that nothing could possibly still be wrong somewhere out on the hillside. We are simply drawing a clear line, the way the shepherd draws his line at the closing of the gate, and saying plainly to whatever part of us keeps circling back through the day's unfinished business, this much is now finished. I have counted what needed counting. Whatever is still out there in the dark, I will go and find it again tomorrow, in the light, when I can actually see well enough to help it. If there is some part of today still circling in your mind tonight, some sheep you are not entirely certain made it back through the gate, some small worry still wandering out there in the dark corners of the evening, you do not need to solve it right now, half asleep in the dark yourself, where nothing can actually be found or fixed. You can simply do what the shepherd does. Count what you can count. Close the gate and trust that whatever is still out on the hillside will still be there tomorrow, waiting for daylight, which is the only time anything was ever going to be found anyway. Let us close the gate together now, gently on whatever the day was carrying. Tomorrow will keep watch over what tomorrow needs to keep watch over. Tonight asks only this much of you: to rest. There is a story about two brothers who inherited, along with their father's small pottery workshop, a single treasured tea bowl that had belonged to their grandmother, said to be the finest piece she had ever made in her long life as a potter, kept always on a high shelf and used only on the rarest occasions, when some guest of particular importance came to visit. Neither brother wanted to see the bowl broken, and each privately believed himself the more careful custodian of it, though this was a belief neither had ever spoken aloud. Since they had shared the workshop peacefully enough for years and saw no reason to disturb that peace over a shelf. One afternoon, the younger brother, dusting the high shelf where the bowl sat, knocked it loose by accident, and though he lunged to catch it, it struck the floor and broke into several pieces before he could stop it. He stood over the shattered bowl in a kind of paralyzed horror, certain that this single accident had undone something irreplaceable, certain too that his older brother, when he came home and learned what had happened, would never quite trust him with anything fragile again. When the older brother returned and saw the pieces laid out on the workbench where the younger one had gathered them, he was quiet for a long moment, and the younger brother braced himself for the anger he felt certain was coming. Instead, the older brother picked up two of the largest pieces and turned them over slowly in his hands, studying the break. "I have heard," he said finally, "of potters in the capital who repair broken bowls not by hiding the crack, but by filling it with gold, so that the mended line becomes part of the bowl's beauty rather than a wound in it, a mark of its whole history rather than only its damage. Perhaps," he said, "we should learn to do the same." The two brothers spent the following weeks teaching themselves this method, mixing a fine gold lacquer and carefully fitting the broken pieces back together along seams traced in gold. And when the bowl was finally whole again, it did not look like a bowl that had been broken and hidden. It looked like a bowl with a story visibly written across it, gold lines running through the pale clay like a river seen from a great height, and though it was, by any strict measure, no longer the same unbroken bowl their grandmother had made, many who saw it afterward said it was somehow more striking now than it had been before. More clearly, the bowl of a family that had lived a long life together, breaks and all. The younger brother asked, once the repair was finished, whether the older brother had truly not been angry that day, or whether he had simply hidden his anger out of kindness. The older brother considered the question honestly before answering. "I felt something sharp for a moment when I first saw the pieces," he admitted. "That is only natural, and I will not pretend otherwise. But by the time I had walked home and had a little time to think, I had already understood something our grandmother herself used to say, which is that nothing made by human hands, however finely made, was ever meant to last forever exactly as it began. She herself broke and remade dozens of bowls across her lifetime before she ever produced one she considered worth keeping. A broken bowl was never a stranger to her. It was simply an ordinary and expected part of a long life spent working with clay. And I saw no reason our grandmother's own bowl should be exempt from the very process her whole life's work had been built upon. This story is often told among those who practice this old method of mending with gold, not really as a story about pottery at all, but as a teaching about how we might learn to hold our own breaks, the ones that happen inside us rather than on a workbench. A friendship strained past what it once was. A plan that shattered before it could be carried out. A version of ourselves we had been certain of that did not survive some difficult year intact. The instinct, when something breaks, is very often to hide the break as completely as possible, to glue the pieces together in secret and hope no one ever notices the seam, or worse, to believe that the breaking has ruined the whole thing permanently, that nothing broken can ever again be counted as whole or beautiful. But the two brothers found something different, and it is worth sitting with for a moment tonight, whatever your own particular break might be. A thing repaired with care. It seems left visible rather than hidden, does not have to be lesser than the thing it was before. It can become, instead, a truer record of an actual life, which was never going to pass through many years without a few things breaking along the way, and which is very often more honest and sometimes more beautiful for showing exactly where those breaks occurred and how they were mended, rather than pretending they never happened at all. You do not need to decide tonight what your own gold seams might look like, or even whether you are ready yet to begin the careful work of mending whatever has broken this year. It is enough, for now, only to remember that the breaking was never the end of the story, the way it can feel like it is in the raw moment right after it happens. The bowl on the shelf in that old workshop went on being used for many more years after its repair, poured from at every important gathering the family held, its gold lines catching the light each time exactly as brightly as the rest of the clay around them. No longer hidden, no longer a source of shame, simply part of what the bowl had become across its whole long life. Let us rest here for a while now, with whatever seams we are each carrying, gold or otherwise, held gently, without needing to hide any of them tonight. There is a small story, almost too simple to be called a story at all, about an old woman who lived at the top of a hill overlooking a wide valley, and who was known by everyone in the villages below for never once in all the years anyone could remember appearing troubled by anything, no matter how much trouble the seasons brought. A neighbor once climbed the hill during a particularly difficult year, when the harvest had failed twice running and half the valley was in genuine distress. Hoping to learn whatever secret kept the old woman so unshaken, while everyone around her grew thin with worry. He found her sitting outside her small house, watching the light move slowly across the valley below, and he asked her directly, "How is it that nothing ever seems to trouble you, even now, when everyone else is afraid?" She was quiet for a while before answering, and when she finally spoke, her answer was shorter than he expected. "Something troubles me every single day," she said. "I'm not free of trouble. I'm only free of the belief that trouble once it arrives, is going to stay forever. He asked her how she had come to believe that so completely, so steadily, when everyone else in the valley clearly did not or could not believe it in the same way. I have simply lived long enough, she said, to watch trouble arrive and pass, more times than I could ever count. Not because I am wiser than the rest of you, only because I am older and I have had more evenings than most people to sit exactly where I am sitting now and watch the light change across this same valley, season after season, hard year after hard year, and every single time, without exception, the light has changed again. I have simply seen it happen enough times now that I no longer doubt it will happen again. However dark this particular evening feels while I am sitting inside it. The neighbor sat with her a while longer, watching the same light she was watching. And though the harvest did not improve that evening, and the trouble in the valley did not lift, because of anything said on that hilltop, he found, walking back down afterward, that something in him had loosened slightly. Some tightness he had been carrying without fully realizing how tightly he had been gripping it. It was not that his troubles had become smaller. It was only that he had borrowed, for a little while, a small piece of her much longer view, her many more evenings of watching the same light change, and it had lent him, for that one walk home at least, a little more room to breathe inside a difficulty that had felt, before he climbed that hill, like it might never end at all. Whatever difficulty you may be sitting inside tonight, large or small, old or new, it is worth remembering, gently, that it is not the first light this particular valley has ever seen change, and it will not be the last. You do not need the old woman's many decades of watching borrow a little of her patience tonight. You only need to remember, for these last few minutes before sleep finally arrives, that whatever tonight is holding, it is already, even now, quietly on its way toward becoming something else. The way every single evening this hillside has ever known has eventually given way to morning without a single exception. In all the long history of mornings that have ever come before this one, let us watch the light change together now, quietly, for a little while, trusting it the way that old woman trusted it, simply because it has never once in all of time failed to change. We have wandered through a great many stories tonight. A boatman who would not let worry take the oars. A monk who met every fortune and misfortune with the same open patience. A lute string tuned neither too tight nor too loose. A young caster who learned that scattered hands make a bell that never rings quite true. An old house slowly repaired one loose window at a time. A pond that only ever needed to be left alone to grow clear again. And a traveler who found, in the end, that the road gives back very often what we carry on to it. None of these stories were ever meant to be remembered in detail. You do not need to hold on to the boatman's name, which he never had, or the exact words the old teacher used beside his pond. What matters, if anything matters here at all, is only the quiet feeling underneath them. The sense that peace was never a destination requiring a long and difficult journey, but something closer at hand than we usually let ourselves believe, waiting patiently, the way that mountain lake waits every single night for the wind to finally settle. And now, as we come toward the close of our time together, I want to turn toward sleep itself for a moment. Because sleep, in its own quiet way, has been the real subject of everything we have discussed tonight without ever saying so directly. No one has ever fallen asleep by gripping harder at the idea of falling asleep. No one has ever settled a restless mind by demanding forcefully that it settle immediately. Sleep, like the pond, like the lake at dawn, only ever arrives once the stirring stops. Once the oars are set down, once the small, effortful reaching toward it is finally, gently released. So there is nothing left for you to do right now except exactly what you are already doing. Breathing, resting your weight into whatever is holding you, letting the day, whatever it held, however it went, settle slowly the way silt settles to the bottom of still water, leaving everything above it clear. You do not need to review the day one more time. You do not need to solve tonight whatever is still unsolved. It will keep. It has always kept every single night before this one, and it will keep again tonight. If your mind wanders, as minds do, as every mind that has ever tried to rest has always done, you do not need to chase it back with force. You can simply notice, softly, where it went. The way that old teacher's student learned to notice, and let it drift back on its own, toward nothing more complicated than this breath in and this breath out, asking nothing else of you. Feel the places in your body that have been holding tension all day without your permission. The shoulders drawn up toward the ears, the jaw held tight, the hands closed a little more than they needed to be. You can let each of these loosen now, one at a time, if that is easier. The shoulders first, then the jaw, then the hands, opening the way a hand opens naturally once it finally remembers it was never actually required to stay clenched. The house of your mind does not need every window shut against the night. You can leave one open, just slightly, the way the woman in the old story left one window cracked beside her bed, enough to hear the world continuing on quietly outside without needing to let the whole of it rush in and disturb you. Everything else can be closed for tonight. There is nothing out there that requires your attention until morning. You are not behind on anything by resting now. You have not failed at anything by feeling however you feel tonight, whether that is calm or unsettled, or somewhere uncertain in between. The lake does not fail when the wind is still moving across it. It only waits, without any struggle at all, for its own nature to return. And it always does return, every single time, without exception. The way morning always comes after even the longest night. Think, if you like, of the old candle makers' flawed candles, still giving their full measure of light, regardless of how straight or how bent they turned out. Think of the shepherd closing his gate on a flock he has counted as well as he is able tonight, trusting the rest to daylight. Think of the mason setting down his tools at the end of an ordinary day, having quarried only the 3 stones that were actually his to quarry, and no more than that. None of them needed to finish everything before they were allowed to rest. None of them needed the whole river crossed, the whole vine grown, the whole bowl mended, before permission to sleep was granted. They simply did what belonged to that day, and let the rest belong to whatever day would come to hold it next. Let your breath grow slower now, with no effort behind the slowing, only permission. Let your body grow heavier against whatever is holding it. The way a stone settles into soft ground, not falling, only arriving fully where it already was. There is nowhere else for you to be right now. There is nothing left that needs deciding, nothing left that needs carrying, nothing left that needs fixing before you are allowed to rest. Whatever stillness you have felt tonight, even for a moment, even for the length of a single story, is not something that needs to be held on too tightly to keep it from disappearing. It will be there again tomorrow, waiting the same patient way that lake waits, the same patient way this breath has been waiting, this whole time, for you to finally stop reaching so hard and simply let it carry you the rest of the way down into sleep. Rest now. There is nothing more required of you tonight. Thank you for spending this quiet time with these old stories and with yourself. Sleep well.